Medieval Europe smelled of smoke, soot, manure, human waste, and decay. The odor was so constant that people barely noticed it anymore. Modern ideas of cleanliness, freshness, and personal hygiene would have seemed like a strange luxury, and sometimes even dangerous madness, to a person living in the 15th or 16th century. The Europe that people today imagine through shining armor, lavish balls, and snow-white palaces was, in reality, a place where even kings lived surrounded by stench, parasites, and disease. The cities of the Middle Ages were cramped and dark. Narrow streets rarely exceeded 6 or 7 feet in width. The upper floors of houses leaned so far over one another that sunlight barely reached the ground. During rainy weather, the streets turned into rivers of mud, and in the heat, into foul-smelling ditches. People dumped waste directly out of their windows. Slop, animal entrails, blood from slaughtered livestock, leftover food, and the contents of chamber pots flowed through open gutters. In 14th century Paris, there was even a rule. Before throwing waste out the window, a person had to shout 3 times, "Beware of the water! Gardes l'eau!" But the rule was far from always followed. Cities looked especially terrifying at night. Street lighting barely existed. In 14th century London, only wealthy districts had a few scattered oil lamps. Most people moved through complete darkness, and in the alleys, a person could literally drown in mud. Chronicles report that during the 1270s, the people of Paris repeatedly complained to King Philip III that filth was piling up directly beside markets and churches. Yet even royal authority was powerless against the absence of a sewer system. In the ancient world, the situation had been different. Ancient Rome possessed one of the most advanced sanitation systems of its time. As early as the 6th century BC, Rome had the Cloaca Maxima, a massive sewer system, parts of which still survive today. Aqueducts supplied cities with water, and public baths were at the center of daily life. The imperial baths of Caracalla, built in the 3rd century AD, could accommodate more than 1,500 people at once. They contained hot and cold pools, steam rooms, massage chambers, libraries, and gardens. But after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, much of that infrastructure collapsed. The barbarian kingdoms could not maintain such complex engineering systems. Aqueducts crumbled, sewers clogged, and city populations declined. Many Roman bathhouses were abandoned or converted into warehouses and fortresses. Even so, the early Middle Ages were not yet an era of total filth. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, bathing traditions still survived in some parts of Europe. Charlemagne, emperor of the Franks, who ruled from 768 to 814, loved bathing in the hot springs of Aachen. His biographer Einhard wrote that the emperor often swam together with his sons and close companions. The Vikings, whom many Europeans considered savages, actually paid more attention to hygiene than much of the continent. English chronicles noted that Scandinavians regularly combed their hair, bathed on Saturdays, and used tweezers to remove unwanted hair. English priests even complained that local women fell too easily under the charm of the Northerners because of it. The turning point came between the 12th and 14th centuries. Cities were growing faster than sanitation could keep up. By the year 1300, Paris had reached a population of roughly 200,000 people. London had around 80,000. For the medieval world, these were enormous megacities. Yet the water remained filthy, and waste continued to be thrown directly into the streets. Butchers poured animal blood into roadside gutters. Tanneries used urine and lime to process leather. Fish markets dumped rotting remains straight into the river. During the summer heat, the smell became unbearable. The chronicler Jean Froissart wrote that some streets in Paris were so foul that people hurried through them as quickly as possible while covering their faces with cloth. Medieval physicians explained disease through the theory of miasma. It was believed that infections came from bad air rising from rot and decay. That is why foul smells inspired almost mystical terror. People believed that if the air smelled bad, it could kill. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe, the deadliest pandemic of the Middle Ages. The plague began in Asia and traveled along trade routes into the Mediterranean. In the autumn of 1347, Genoese ships arrived in the Sicilian city of Messina. On board were dying sailors covered in black buboes. The disease spread with astonishing speed. Within just a few years, Europe lost between 25 and 50 million people. In Florence, according to the writings of Giovanni Boccaccio, people died directly in the streets. Parents abandoned sick children. Wagons filled with corpses rolled daily toward mass graves. In London, cemeteries overflowed so quickly that authorities opened enormous pits for mass burials. After the plague, attitudes toward water changed even more dramatically. People began to believe that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Doctors recommended avoiding bathing altogether. Some 15th-century medical texts openly claimed that baths weakened the body and made a person vulnerable to death. The church also became increasingly hostile toward public bathhouses. In many cities, baths had turned into centers of prostitution. In Paris and Nuremberg, bath attendants were often prostitutes as well. As a result, by the 16th century, most public baths had been shut down. In 1538, King Francis I of France ordered restrictions on public bathhouses in Paris. In England, King Henry VIII closed the famous London stews, the bathhouses of Southwark, in 1546, officially because of the spread of syphilis. Syphilis became one of the great terrors of late 15th and 16th century Europe. The disease first spread on a massive scale after the Italian Wars of 1494 to 1495. The army of the French King Charles VIII invaded Naples, and afterward, soldiers carried the infection across the continent. The disease attacked the skin, bones, and brain. Victims lost their hair, their noses deteriorated, and ulcers spread across their bodies. The treatments were horrifying. Patients were covered in mercury ointments, forced to sit inside overheated rooms, and made to inhale toxic vapors. A saying even emerged at the time: one night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Fear of syphilis intensified hatred toward bathhouses and physical contact. Increasingly, bodily cleanliness was replaced by attempts to disguise odor. By the 16th century, Europe was practically drowning in perfume. Fragrance became not a luxury, but a necessity. French and Italian aristocrats carried aromatic balls called pomanders. Inside them were musk, ambergris, lavender, rosemary, and rose petals. People believed pleasant smells could protect them from disease. It was during this period that the cult of wigs was born. In France, the fashion for enormous powdered wigs reached its peak under King Louis XIV. The king began wearing wigs after he started losing his hair, most likely because of illness and constant stress. The royal court immediately copied him. These wigs were heavy, hot, and incredibly filthy. They were rarely cleaned. Fleas and lice thrived inside them. To ease the suffering of the nobility, special long scratching sticks were even created so people could scratch their heads without removing their wigs. Even royal bedrooms were breeding grounds for parasites. Bedding was changed infrequently. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, which became infested with bedbugs. That is one reason why beds were built with canopies, not for beauty, but to prevent insects and debris from falling on sleeping people from the ceiling above. Versailles, the symbol of French grandeur, was at the same time one of the dirtiest palaces in Europe. Construction of the palace began in 1661. By the end of the 17th century, thousands of people crowded its halls every day. Courtiers, servants, officers, musicians, cooks, and guests. Yet permanent toilets barely existed. People relieved themselves in the gardens, behind curtains, inside fireplaces, and throughout the corridors. The gardeners of Versailles constantly complained about ruined flower beds. In the memoirs of the Duke of St. Simon, there are descriptions of courtiers casually urinating during walks through the palace grounds. The smell inside the palace was reportedly so overpowering that foreign diplomats sometimes fainted. Russian ambassadors at the court of Louis XIV wrote that the French king stank like a wild beast. That did not necessarily mean the monarch himself was exceptionally filthy, simply that, by the standards of Europe at the time, such smells were considered almost normal. Louis XIV himself suffered from countless illnesses. He dealt with inflamed teeth, gout, hemorrhoids, and skin infections. In 1686, the king underwent an extremely painful operation to remove an anal fistula. The surgery was performed without anesthesia and became a sensation across Europe. Dental problems, in general, became a symbol of the aristocracy of the early modern age. Sugar, which during the Middle Ages had been an expensive spice, began arriving in huge quantities from the colonies during the 17th century. Wealthy people consumed enormous amounts of sweets. Queen Elizabeth I of England adored sugary delicacies. By old age, her teeth had blackened and begun to decay. In 1598, the German traveler Paul Hensner wrote that the Queen's breath was extremely unpleasant. The French King Louis XIV also lost nearly all of his teeth. During the removal of one tooth, doctors accidentally pierced his palate. Food began passing into his nasal cavity while he ate. The king was forced to eat slowly and carefully for the rest of his life. Women's cosmetics of the era were often lethally dangerous. To achieve aristocratic pale skin, noble women covered their faces with lead-based white makeup. Over time, the skin deteriorated, became covered in ulcers and scars, and then even more powder was applied on top. Especially infamous was the English Venetian ceruse, popular at the court of Elizabeth I. Constant exposure to lead caused hair loss, tooth decay, and chronic poisoning. By the 18th century, European cities grew even larger, yet sanitation problems still remained. London suffered from severe overcrowding. The River Thames turned into a gigantic sewer. During the hot summer of 1858, an event occurred that entered history as the Great Stink. The smell from the river became so unbearable that members of the British Parliament hung curtains soaked in chloride of lime over the windows. It was after this catastrophe that construction of London's modern sewer system began under engineer Joseph Bazalgette. Massive underground tunnels would transform the city and save millions of lives. Before that time, cholera regularly devastated European populations. The epidemics of 1831, 1848, and 1854 claimed tens of thousands of lives. People still believed in miasma theory until the English physician John Snow proved the connection between contaminated water and disease. In 1854, during a cholera outbreak in the Soho district, Snow noticed that nearly all the victims had taken water from the same public pump on Broad Street. When the pump handle was removed, the epidemic began to fade. It became a revolution in the understanding of hygiene. Almost at the same time, the Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis made an even more horrifying discovery. While working in a Vienna hospital during the 1840s, he noticed that women died after childbirth far more often in the wards staffed by medical students. The reason was terrifyingly simple. Doctors performed autopsies and then delivered babies without washing their hands. Semmelweis introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solutions. Mortality rates dropped several times over. Yet his colleagues mocked him. Only decades later would the principles of antiseptics finally gain recognition. The true revolution came through the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. In the second half of the 19th century, they proved the existence of microbes. Humanity finally understood that diseases were caused not by curses or foul smells, but by bacteria and viruses. From that moment, a new era began. Cities built sewer systems and water pipelines. Public bathhouses returned. Cheap soap and mass-produced toothbrushes appeared. By the end of the 19th century, the American inventor Joseph Gady launched industrial production of toilet paper. But the memory of centuries of filth remained. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, many European homes still lacked bathrooms. Regular showering became the norm only after the Second World War. The history of medieval hygiene is a story of fear, ignorance, and humanity's struggle against diseases it did not understand. People sincerely believed that water itself could kill. Kings surrounded by gold and silk suffered from lice, ulcers, and rotting teeth. Princesses hid body odor beneath layers of perfume. And the greatest palaces of Europe were often filthier than modern slums. That is why stories claiming that kings never bathe are not simply myths. Behind them lies the real history of a world where cleanliness was considered, for centuries, not salvation, but a threat.